Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden and this is the Top 10 DC Universe Concepts. So today's video is a relatively simple topic, but a request I'm glad to have gotten. We're going to talk about the larger ideas and concepts within the DC Universe. From Power Rings to Power Girl, it's going to be my favorite ideas when it comes to all things DC. The way I went about making this list is just by what I consider the greatest ideas best used throughout DC history. The ones most interesting to me, which I think produced the most creative content from the company, as well as a few standout factions or ideas I feel are worth mentioning. In a lot of ways, this top 10 became pretty competitive. The world of DC is rich in content and had to make some tough calls or big generalizations just to fit in some of my favorite parts of this fictional universe. So with all that in mind, let's get started. Number 10. Time travel. We start out with a simple concept, but one of vital importance to the world of DC. I have criticized time travel recently within the context of DC, but as I've said and will repeat here, I don't think it should be disregarded entirely, nor is it a bad thing for the DC universe. The truth couldn't really be farther from that. Time travel is great when used right, and many DC comics do exactly that. Whether it's having adventures with heroes gone back in time or filling out whole rosters of characters whose origins lie exclusively in the future, time travel is a fundamental element of DC canon. That time that Batman was flung back in time, got to hang out with cave people for a while before working his way towards the present, or even the very existence of certain characters like Booster Gold, Rip Hunter, or the entire legion of superheroes. It gives connections to different heroes across different time periods, effectively bridging the gap between all eras of what has become a rich history of content, thanks in no small part to the very effects of time travel. It's a very fun way to have Batman team up with Jonah Hex, or Superman to hang out with the future Justice League for a while, and that has led to some really cool stories. Even now, when stuff was rewritten or rebooted to various degrees, time travel is still a helpful tool for writers to convey fun stories and is an important part of DC canon. It can be useful for us as a reader, too, when we see stories that take place entirely in the future, like Batman Beyond, Cormandi, or Kingdom Come. There, time travel and certain characters who can survive across time periods give those stories some sense of connectivity within the present, and because they're future stories, they kind of are time travel stories in and of themselves. It's also vital in informing classic events and stories from the likes of Flashpoint and so many other stories, especially involving the Flash. I feel it's also worth mentioning that the show Legends of Tomorrow does a great job at showcasing the kind of fun you can have with time travel in the DC universe, as imperfect as that show may be. But still, it's good, it's worth checking out. It's a good element of DC canon, but a really straightforward one. Time travel is something that I admit other franchises tend to do a better job with when compared to DC, although in over 75 years of history that's obviously a bit of a generalization. My point being that while I like time travel, there are other ideas I feel DC has done better stuff with. Let's move on to one of them. Number 9. Batman's contingency plans. This one might feel a bit out of step with some of the other content on this top 10. But I thought a lot about this and think it's still one of the best ideas in all of DC. After all, the Justice League and specifically the Trinity form a core part of the entire DC lineup. And out of all the mythology and content surrounding these three characters, it's Batman's consistent contingency planning that I find most interesting for many different reasons. It makes sense to prepare for the worst because in the world of DC, or just with superheroes, the worst is always right around the corner. So we see this express itself in two very important ways through Batman, both with strong positive effects on the ongoing stories within the DC universe as a whole. In one way, whenever the Justice League or Batman or his family might need the resources to stop a villain in a specific way, odds are Batman is ready for it. Need a network of satellites to broadcast a signal around the world? No problem, Batman is ready for it just in case. Need a submarine to visit Atlantis? We've got every type of vehicle you can imagine. Just in case. Need a machine to restore your memories after you fell into a hole and nearly died? Just in case. In this regard, Batman is basically a big get-out-of-jail-free card for writers, for better or worse. Most of the time this leads to big epic resolutions of villainous plots, and if there's enough setup we can forgive the spectacular way these plots are resolved. After all, this has been used to do really cool things, not the least of which includes an army of mech robots rampaging through Gotham City. And who in their right mind would object to that? Hell, even Batman's tendency to design experimental suits has led to countless cool scenes and concepts throughout the history of this character. All this being said, that feels inferior to the better way Batman's constant over-preparedness expresses itself in the way that he prepares to stop his fellow Justice League members and other characters in the DC universe in case they ever go bad. On the surface, this seems like questionable behavior. But when we think about contingencies and the fact that superhero history is littered with examples of heroes going bad, losing control, or they encounter evil versions of themselves, that it's kind of stupid that every superhero team doesn't do this same thing when we get right down to it. Batman is very justified in this behavior, in my eyes, but I also think it's quite fair that it doesn't sit well with the other heroes of the Justice League. Remember, this whole concept came from the Tower of Babel story, a short Justice League community that the idea gets revisited again and again in both comics and other media, because it's a very cool idea. It forces the writers to acknowledge and create certain weaknesses in their own superheroes, making them more than just undefeatable titans. The whole concept adds conflict, and within conflict comes drama and stakes, a vital part of any story. In spite of all the recent whinging about heroes fighting heroes, some tension is needed. I'm not saying they should always be at each other's throats, but these things are worth discussing within the Justice League and other teams. The whole thing I find to be one of the most important elements of not only Batman's character, or even the Justice League, but as a result of it all, the entire DC universe itself. Plenty of characters draw from Batman's resources, and it spills out into most aspects of DC, and that's a very cool thing. But, not the coolest thing. And don't worry, we're not going to talk about everything as much as I have this. Number 8. Bureaucracy. Now this one's gotta seem weird on the surface, but hear me out on what I mean by this. So you know how in Marvel pretty much all superhero government relations these days are done through S.H.I.E.L.D.? Like sure, there's other factions, some real world like the US military or the NYPD, others fictional like SWORD, a faction of S.H.I.E.L.D. that deals with the interplanetary affairs. But by and large, if you're dealing with superhero officials in the world of Marvel, you're dealing with S.H.I.E.L.D. Now S.H.I.E.L.D. is fine, flawed in some ways and limited in what it can do story-wise, but usually they're a convenient way to have some fun in the world of Marvel. And I mean, the helicarriers are cool, you just can't deny that. All this being said, I kind of like DC's approach to how the government deals with superheroes a lot better. I've always felt it was a little weird that in response to the emergence of superheroes, the world's reaction would be to give unilateral power to an international organization like S.H.I.E.L.D. That kind of gradually evolved in Marvel, and many stories in both the comics and the MCU have done interesting things dealing with this over the years. But I think DC's attitude and history in regard to this feels a lot more, we'll say realistic, or at least as realistic as you can get in the world of superheroes. The impression I get looking broadly at the history of DC is that as superheroes surged as a presence on their Earth, many different organizations, factions, individuals, and attitudes have all led to varying levels of power and influence within DC. So we have teams like Checkmate and Suicide Squad, big organizations like Argus and Star Labs, official organizations like the police forces of Central City, Gotham, and Metropolis, and they've grown and expanded with all sorts of tech and resources specifically to deal with the crazy sorts of threats they encounter. There's those guys that deal with aliens from the Supergirl series. Behind the scenes, Shade and other groups handle monsters and mystical threats, while Spiral, a group of spies with shady tactics, runs around the world doing all sorts of clandestine operations, usually for the good. And that's just everything I can kind of think of off the top of my head. There's other little groups and factions, and different countries have their own organizations as well. All of these are controlled by various people who vie for territory and power. This includes cool characters like Maxwell Lord, or that creepy girl that controls Shade, but the best example of this is in Amanda Waller. Everyone has their own agenda, resources, and abilities, but nobody plays that game better than Waller herself. The whole thing gives the world of DC a feeling of layers, history, and a certain sense of realism. It lets the situation between the superheroes and the government be fluid, depending on what's going on in the world, and given what the writer wants to do with their story. This is why some teams might operate entirely outside of the law, while others take marching orders from liaisons and commanders of questionable intent and motive. It allows for flexibility, and helps to grade the world of DC a little bit. Characters like Amanda Waller are especially great at this, and it can push characters outside of situations that they normally encounter as superheroes and villains. Many of these people have the public good in mind, but sometimes their tactics and behavior can seem brutal and a real change of pace from the Justice League and the main heroes we're used to. These groups and characters are both an important and really fun part of DC canon, and I couldn't possibly exclude them from this list. Number 7. The Reach. Next up is a very cool niche of the DC universe I definitely wanted to include in this top 10. The Reach are an awesome villainous faction with a cool story and a great part in the canon. As a group of cybernetic insectoid aliens powerful enough to stand up to even the Green Lanterns, the Reach arrived at a truce with the Guardians of the Universe and agreed to stop their endless conquering of worlds across the universe. However, they secretly took a new approach to expanding their empire through these scarabs. These devices would bond with a native of a prospective world the Reach wanted to conquer. Initially serving as a protector of that world, the scarab will gather information on this new world before it eventually forces its host to turn on its own race, allowing for the Reach to easily conquer these planets. One scarab would eventually fall to Earth and gain its own sentience. Binding with Jamie Reyes, it went rogue and became the Blue Beetle. Meanwhile, throughout Jamie's history and story, he's met a lot of other factions and forces that existed and spiraled out of the Reach themselves. I find these beings very cool and one of the best examples of alien concepts outside of the Lantern Corps. There's nothing wrong with the Lanterns, but sometimes it feels like the Corps are the only thing out there in DC's wide world of space. Races and groups like the Reach help to show the galaxy is bigger than the world of the Green Lanterns, and I like that. I also appreciate they are basically on the level of the Green Lanterns, so they can't simply be defeated by brute force. As far as I can tell, the last we heard from these guys, they scored a major victory against the Blue Lanterns and have become more powerful than ever because of it. In Rebirth, it seems that they're stepping away from the Reach as the Blue Beetle has been given a new origin and such, but that doesn't mean they are gone forever or won't turn up again. They're pretty great, so when that day comes, I look forward to it. Number 6. Magic. The importance of magic and its role in DC seems fairly obvious and given to me. Like with Marvel, magic provides entire domains of superpowers, heroes, factions, concepts, and characters. It can be the source of mind-bending art, great stories, or formidable villains. It informs characters ranging in tone from Shazam to Constantine. This is all well and good within the world of DC, but the best part about magic is when it comes to this company, magic is the great equalizer. A challenge when writing for a superhero team, but especially the Justice League, is always to create a balance of power and stakes between these characters. With heroes as strong as Superman and Wonder Woman, it can be tough crafting opponents and threats on the level of those two, let alone some of the other high-powered heroes on the team. Magic is a great way to balance this out. One of Superman's weaknesses that I feel works better than the more famous kryptonite, and just about the only thing that can reliably overpower Wonder Woman, magic makes just about any sort of story plausible without feeling cheap, and gives the writer and artist a lot of creative freedom and license in superhero stories. As long as it isn't too badly abused, it can be a lot of fun. Like just about every item on this top 10, that concept has been overused before, to the disservice of various stories, but by and large, magic is a great way to make things unpredictable and allow for all sorts of cool and crazy stories to come out of DC. It's an important and great part of the universe. Number 5. The Speed Force. Next up is an easy choice I'm sure we all expected to show up at some point on this list. The Speed Force is a fundamental part of one of the basic properties of the DC universe. Essentially a realm that represents the ultimate point of destination for any speedster, where they are moving so fast they're essentially everywhere at once, as I understand it, allowing speedsters access to an untold amount of energy and the ability to travel almost anywhere through time and space. The effects of this are felt throughout the DC universe, as the Speed Force is tied directly into the basic operations of the entire multiverse to a degree that's not really ever been fully defined. Because of the Speed Force's fundamental role in the universe, by association the Flash is almost always involved in any given multiversal crisis, as we've seen over the many years. I think of the Speed Force as the DC equivalent of the Siege Perilous, deliberately defined poorly to allow writers a lot of flexibility in terms of what the Speed Force can and can't do. It's a very enigmatic source of power that has led to an array of very cool moments, and will no doubt lead to many more in the future. It's a little amazing to me that I wound up putting this at the number 5 spot, to be honest. The Speed Force is very cool, and I think it's an awesome part of the DC universe. But there were some concepts that were so good that the Speed Force was simply beaten out. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I just thought of some things that are a little more interesting. Number 4. The Parliaments. An often overlooked part of the DC is the Parliaments, ancient orders that look over various domains of life. There's the green, which empowers the Swamp Thing and ties into the natural world of plants. The red governs the domains of beasts and uses Animal Man as its avatar. Then there's the Rot, a force in the DC world that represents death and decay. Over time, we've been introduced to other parliaments as well, such as the Clear, which represents aquatic life and is tied to Aquaman, the Grey, associated with fungus, another new parliament that represents technology, and another one that represents human ideas and raw imagination. Each of these parliaments tend to have their own avatar and unique connection to the things which they represent. At the core, I find this idea very fascinating, even if it does breach into other aspects of other domains within the DC universe. You kinda just have to ignore that stuff in a world where hell exists alongside, like, Olympus. What's cool is that there's these politics and power struggles between these groups that have led to epic stories, while each of the parliaments have their own, often incredibly imaginative and surreal content that comes with them. When the Arbiters visit the parliament, it's often in these surreal, dreamlike worlds that are beyond ours and with strange rules and all this really crazy, surreal content. You kind of just have to see it for yourself in the comics. The parliaments feel like they exist at the edge of reality, a mystical source of power that is raw and immense in strength, yet always struggling to maintain a certain sense of balance with the other parliaments. Even with all this power, their position always feels kind of precarious, especially when these domains become at odds with or empowered by the human race itself. My favorite part in all of this is some of the associations they created between the parliaments of other DC characters. Heroes like Vixen and Beast Boy have ties to the red, while others like Poison Ivy and Black Orchid are associated with the green. On Earth 2, Alan Scott's different version of the Green Lantern energy comes from the green itself. The whole concept is really cool and has led to some of the best stories in all of DC. From its roots in Alan Moore comics to the modern age penned by the likes of Scott Snyder and Charles Soule, the Parliaments are easily one of my favorite concepts in all of DC. Number 3. The Lanterns. Like the Speed Force, I don't doubt for a moment that everyone expected this one. Some of you may have thought this was going to be, or deserves to be, number 1. In the end, there were 2 concepts I thought topped the Lantern Corps, but I do love the 9 Corps and think it's an essential part of the DC canon. I love the idea of the Lantern Rings being an expression of various emotions. The idea that a Green Lantern is only as strong as the extent of his willpower, or a Red Lantern's power is tied into their rage, and so on and so forth. It's a really cool concept fundamental to the Lantern Corps and one of my favorite parts about the DC universe because of it. The Lanterns are a pretty amazing addition to this fictional world, especially the other Corps beyond the Green Lanterns introduced by Geoff Johns. While I agree they have been overplayed a bit, the idea of each Corps is still a very cool one to me. They all have different philosophies, organizational structures, cool characters, and their own behaviors and attitudes. It's cool learning about them and seeing them in action, and some of them even explain some really interesting ideas within the whole DC world itself. Blackest Night and what it revealed about the Black Lanterns was a really clever take on the whole comic book death thing, but I don't want to get too much into that right now. One of the things I really like about all of this, and was a big feature of Blackest Night actually, was seeing how the lantern rings work with the other members of the superhero community. In fact, my favorite part of that event is where one of the Guardians deputizes characters from Earth into each of the Lantern Corps. So we got to see characters like Barry Allen as a Blue Lantern, Wonder Woman with the power of the Violet Corps, and Lex Luthor taking on Agent Orange in an amazing and great example of the sort of fun we can have with the lanterns and stories. Let alone the vast list of badass yellow lanterns we've seen over the years. Cyborg Superman, Scarecrow, Batman, Superman himself, the Anti-Monitor. There's a lot of really cool characters on this list. Oh, I guess Sinestro's interesting too. Whatever. Another really cool feature of Blackest Night actually is we got to see what each character in the DC universe associates with most in terms of the emotional spectrum. And that was a really cool character exercise on the whole. The whole thing is, seeing different characters and what emotions they relate to is an awesome aspect of all of this. Taking all that aside, you either like the Skittle Corps or you don't. But even if you don't, you can't deny the awesome potential of the Green Lanterns themselves. They alone present a full roster of great characters, a robust and complicated history, and all sorts of neat little extra details. Mogo alone is one of my favorite characters in all of comic books, but I think there's other great ideas floating around the Green Lantern mythos like the Alphas or Ion or the Guardians. Like I said, it's easy to define the Lanterns as an essential part of DC. Everything Green Lantern, the story around them, and what they bring to the table is almost vital. We don't talk about these guys nearly enough here on Comic Island, and I aim to start changing that in the future, but for now, they should take their bronze medal with pride. It's a really good spot considering what's coming. Number 2. The Gods. In both Marvel and DC, the pantheon of long-established and long-abandoned religions have often served as a deep well for stories and characters that modern writers and artists can draw from. You can't offend anyone by taking creative liberties from that stuff, and it's a really fun list of characters you can use. The best example of this in DC is the mythology and characters that often surround Wonder Woman, usually to the benefit of that character and her story. That's fine, great even, but when we consider how Marvel does the same with Thor, DC is pretty standard in that regard. This sort of thing is important and very useful for telling stories in DC, but on its own, this would have been at the bottom of this list, and certainly not the second most important concept in all of DC. No. The reason the gods are special and take this figurative silver medal is thanks to the new gods. Starting with the legendary run of Jack Kirby I've heard best described as pure creativity, the dual worlds of New Genesis and Apocalypse have been the source of inspiration for so many intensely vivid and creative stories over the years. Beyond Kirby, we've even involved the talents of Mike Mignola, Jim Starlin, Grant Morrison, and even some of the New 52 stuff with Jeff Johns, all of which have been, on the whole, really good and deeply imaginative content. Meanwhile, Tom King seems to be cooking up something very interesting this year with the Mr. Miracle series, which is coming out right around the time this video is going to be published. Overall, the gods, their contribution to the DC mythos, and the very idea behind so many of these characters make them easily one of the best parts in all of DC. Darkseid, Big Barda, Orion, Mr. Miracle, the Furies, Granny Goodness, Steppenwolf, Metron, the Black Racer, so many amazing characters spin out of the new gods and onto the pages of so many great comics. And with the new gods come a mountain of cool concepts that stick with the world of DC on the whole. The anti-life equation, boom tubes, mother boxes, the source and the wall that encompasses it, the sentient living supercycle. The list goes on and on, has these great ties with the whole DC universe at this point, with almost an endless array of great ideas and stories that come out of these comics because of the deep, truly original creative wealth that Jack Kirby made all those years ago. Without a doubt, the gods, and especially the new gods, represent one of the best aspects of DC, with only one idea that consistently beat it out. Number 1. The Multiverse. I find it an interesting form of symmetry that we started this list with time travel and end things with the multiverse. It wasn't intentional, it just kind of worked out that way. Both are similar concepts, old and familiar throughout all of science fiction, and certainly neither are unique to DC. While I feel other franchises have made better use of time travel, though, DC might be the single greatest franchise when it comes to the use of the multiverse as an idea. No other concept in all DC is so thoroughly ingrained into the story of the comics as a whole. In fact, I think the only real way to understand the history of DC Comics is through the lens of a multiverse. While Marvel is constantly restructuring itself to basically keep everything together in one giant sliding timeline as best they can, where basically every story you've ever read has happened only a few years ago, and that's their choice and it has its pros and cons, DC is best understood as existing in eras. We don't need to go through it all, but we sort of have different periods of DC depending on the status of the multiverse. The initial Golden Age stories were regulated to that of a different Earth from the pre-Crisis world. Then post-Crisis, things gradually changed until there was only one universe. Then we got the New 52, Rebirth, and so on and so forth. The point is each era has different rules, different sets of multiverses, sort of, and the waxing and waning within the multiverse pretty much defines every step in these stories. Of course, any concept can be misused or abused, but on the whole, the multiverse not only gives us more fun ideas, cool characters, and great stories, it just works and is a lot of fun. You can think of the value of the multiverse and how many great stories we get out of it. Flashpoint, Forever Evil, and Multiversity all serve as great modern examples, but the history of DC Comics are filled with more. Red Sun, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Gotham by Gaslight all come to mind. But we can even consider movies and other media like Gods and Monsters and Injustice, which use the idea of alternate universes incredibly effectively. How the entire existence of characters like Power Girl, Owlman, or the roster of the Justice Society of America owe a lot, if not their entire history, to the very idea of a multiverse. Oh, I guess you too, Superboy Prime. Go away! It's the coolest aspect of DC if you ask me, essentially giving the writers an endless playground to draw content and characters from. Within the multiverse, we can always wonder what if, and explore any number of variations of the characters and stories that make up the backbone of DC canon. In fact, if you ask me, the most limited times in DC history is where the multiverse is most restricted. The content should not be overused, obviously, but having the freedom of multiple worlds is a great feature of the DC universe. In my eyes, it's the very best thing the entire franchise has to offer, if I had to single out one concept, which I did. And I picked this. So that's the top 10. Thanks for watching, and let me know what your favorite DC concept is in the comments section below. Is there any big thing you think I missed? I'm always curious to hear what you guys have to say, and I'm sure I forgot something. Special thanks to Jeremy Renfro for another great Patreon-based prioritized request, and thanks to all our supporters. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.